Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Platform, an event series of socially engaged artists, collectives, and curators in conversation. This is really strange. I'm in so-called Southern California, and we just had huge thunderstorms, and I lost Wi-Fi, so I'm somewhat live via my iPhone and a candle and a flashlight. So I hope you guys can see me okay. So we'll just continue with the program as is. Tonight's presentation of Platform is the fifth of a six-part series, and it is hosted by Cal State Fullerton and Cal State Dominguez Hills. And representing Cal State Fullerton is myself, Jennifer Frias, Director and Curator of the Begovich Gallery, and John Spiak, Director and Chief Curator at Grand Central Art Center. And representing Cal State Dominguez Hills is Andrea Stang, Assistant Professor and Gallery Director of the University Art Gallery, and Santos Nunez, who is engineering all the behind the scenes matrix of this webinar. So both Andrea and John will be joining us later after our main presentation. And so before we get started with our program, I'd like to begin by recognizing that we here at Cal State Fullerton and Cal State Dominguez Hills, although we're all meeting in virtual spaces, acknowledges that we are on traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Gabrielino Tongva Nation, and we express our gratitude to the Indigenous land caretakers for protecting these sacred sites where we gather today. Tonight's presentation of Platform is organized by Consortium, a collaborative of Cal State University art galleries and museums that formed together as a result of the pandemic with a mission to keep our art institutions meaningful and impactful in order to better serve our students and our communities. I just want to remind everyone that tonight's presentation is being recorded and is being live closed caption. And throughout the program, we welcome you to post your comments on the chat section, and we encourage those who have questions to post them in the Q&A box below your screen, and we'll go over them after our presentation. And when you do post your question, please let us know what campus you're affiliated with. Now, for our main event, I am beyond thrilled to be here tonight for the opportunity to introduce to you our distinguished guests, artist Howardena Pindell and curator at the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, Valerie Cassel Oliver. And in case this is your first introduction to our guests, here's some information about them. Howardena Pindell was born in Philadelphia in 1943. She studied painting at Boston University and Yale University. After graduating, she accepted a job at the Museum of Modern Art, where she worked from 1967 to 1979, first as exhibition assistant, and then assistant curator in the Department of National and International Traveling Exhibitions, and finally as assistant curator and acting director in the department in 1979, Stony Brook, where she is now a professor. Throughout her career, she has exhibited extensively at notable venues such as the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, the Cyrus Gallery and Garth Brennan Gallery in New York, Spelman College Museum of Fine Art in Atlanta, and the Shed in New York, to name a few. She was the subject of the 2018 retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago entitled Howardena Pindell, What Remains to Be Seen, which traveled to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and the Rose Art Museum in Massachusetts. And just a little insight into Howardena Pindell's work. She often employs lengthy metaphorical processes of destruction and reconstruction, where canvases are cut into strips and sewn back together, building up surfaces and elaborate stages. Most of her paintings are installed unstretched, held to the wall merely by the strength of a few finishing nails. Her fascination with imagery is gridded and serialized along with surface texture that appears throughout her composition. In her later, more political charged work, she reverts to these themes in order to address social issues of homelessness, AIDS, war, genocide, sexism, xenophobia, and apartheid. Joining Howardena Pindell in conversation is Valerie Cassel Oliver, who is the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to her position at the VMFA, she was Senior Curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. She has served as director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and as program specialist at the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2000, she was one of 6 curators selected to organize the Biennial for the Whitney Museum of American Art. During her tenure at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, Cassel Oliver organized numerous exhibitions, including the acclaimed Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women Artists, and the Moving Image since 1970 with Dr. Andrea Barnwell Brownlee, a major retrospective on Benjamin Patterson entitled Born in the State of Fluxus, and Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art. She has also worked on significant survey exhibitions for Donald Moffat, Trenton Doyle Hancock, Jenny C. Jones, Angel Otero, and Annabeth Rosen. At the VMFA, her debut exhibition was a survey of our esteemed guest tonight, Howardena Pindell. Named as one of the most influential exhibitions of the decade, Cassel Oliver, along with Naomi Beckwith, who is a Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, co-organized Howardena Pindell, What Remains to be Seen. The exhibition is the first major survey of Pindell's work spanning over 5 decades. Cassel Oliver is also responsible for some of the most significant projects as of recent, including Cosmologies from the Tree of Life, which feature newly acquired works from the Souls Grown Deep Found Rumors of War, which was Wiley's response to the Confederate statues by directly engaging the national conversation around monuments and their role in perpetuating incomplete histories and inequalities. And if you're able to venture into the VMFA early this summer, Valerie Cassel Oliver is currently working on a group exhibition entitled The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and Sonic Impulse, which is scheduled to open in May. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Getty Curatorial Research Fellowship, the David C. Driscoll Award at the High Museum, and the James A. Porter Book Award from Howard University, to name a few. She holds an MA in Art History from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and a BS degree in Communications from the University of Texas at Austin. On behalf of my consortium colleagues and the California State University, it is an honor and with great pleasure to welcome Howardena Pindell and Valerie Cassel Oliver.
Thank you, Jennifer. Howardena?
I'm here.
How are you, my dear?
Oh, I'm okay. I'm okay.
We're delighted to be here, if I may speak on your behalf to say as much.
Yes. Yes, I'm thrilled. I'm just a little nervous tonight.
Yes. And we will make this as painless as possible. For those who are on the West Coast, Howardena and I are located on the East Coast. And so given the time difference, we thought it better to pre-script a few questions. And so we will be speaking based on a series of questions which have been crafted and scripted answers. And that will become more fluid conversation as we go along. But just so that you will know, this is pre-scripted. And we're really delighted to have you here. And thank you for your interest in learning more about this extraordinary woman that Naomi and I had the great pleasure of journeying into her life and celebrating all that it has yielded thus far. So I want to begin. This is an arc which is designed to really give a little bit of insight into becoming an artist, and then once being an artist, how you're using that platform as you have progressed over the years. So I'll start by asking, what was the moment? What was the crystalline moment for you, Howardena, when you decided you wanted to become an artist in your recollection? What would you say that was?
Okay, I apologize to everyone. I have to read a script. It's senior moments and a head injury. But anyway, excuse me. It was more a series of events My third grade teacher informed my parents that I was very talented and I should be taken to museums, art galleries, and introduced to adult artists. My parents introduced me to both Black as well as white artists, male as well as female artists. I was taken to the Philadelphia Museum by default as someone had seen an encaustic Fayum portrait painting, that's Egypt, on a fragment of linen mummy wrapping. They said it looks like me. That was my first introduction to the museum. The section that really drew me in was their Duchamp collection and a small piece, a white metal cage titled Why Not Sleep Sneeze, Rose c'est la vie, or somewhat like that. My parents took me to the Fleischer Art Memorial on Saturdays for their drawing classes for children. I was 8 years old and the youngest in the class and the only non-white. The other children were not particularly friendly. When I graduated from high school, I entered Boston University's School of Fine and Applied Art. I understand that they admitted only one Black student into their BFA program a year.
Wow. And then from there, you went to Yale, correct?
Yes, yes.
Mhm. Now, you emerged from Yale, if I'm not mistaken, the first female graduate student to receive a degree from Yale University at the time.
I don't think
Um,
so. I don't think so.
I know that Barbara Chase Rabeau had received an undergraduate degree, but in terms of a graduate degree, um,
I don't think so.
well,
I don't know. I don't know.
well, we can investigate that further. I think Naomi
Okay.
and I determined that that was in fact the case.
Oh, that's
But
interesting.
to move that forward, I will just say that when you determine that you wanted to be an artist with a capital A, we're talking really the 1960s. And
Okay.
to be both female and to be an African American emerging from Yale with a determination to become an artist, you must have faced tremendous challenges and obstacles. So, how did those challenges really shape your voice? How did it eventually and ostensibly shape your work?
Okay. There were a lot of roadblocks, but occasionally there was a good person who would be a healing influence. Walter Murch was one of my favorite teachers. This is at Boston University, as he treated each student with loving kindness. Sidney Horowitz, my anatomy teacher, was also very supportive. I ran into many objections, including from a student's wealthy parents who offered the school money if they would get rid of me.
Mm,
I was warned by one of my white male teachers, Lloyd Lilly, a sculptor, who said that the parents uh, did not win, and literally said that I should go to the show on with the big boys, is how he put it. This was in 1963. Numerous white female friends' parents objected to me, and one of my friend's parents was so upset that they transferred their daughter to Rutgers University in New Jersey. Both of us played guitar and gave concerts on campus at the Hillel House. I had learned from her Jewish folk songs. A few years later, I had my DNA done, and I found on my mother's side two Ashkenazi markers, one Sephardim and one Palestinian. I had an Armenian friend who would go to movies with me at MIT. Her mother eventually told me to stay away from her daughter.
mm,
I remember one movie we went to at MIT. It was part of a Russian film series. A male MIT student offered to give her a ride back to BU, but he did not want me in the car, but I got in anyway. One of the saddest experiences was that I had a Finnish graduate student who I became friendly with. She invited me to have dinner with her family, the one she lived with as a foreign student. When I saw her, she burst into tears and said that I could not come to dinner and I never saw her again. I
mm.
assume the family forbid her from befriending me and demanded that I never see her again. It felt I was often blindsided. Any restaurant in Boston could refuse to serve you based on their racism. I ran for an office in the dorm and was removed from the ballot. It was a large dorm. There were only two Black women living there. The house mother and student committee took me off of the ballot. I am sure that all of this trauma and drama made me very sensitive to issues of racism in the arts and daily life. It was technically during segregation and Jim Crow in the South and rising tide of the civil rights movement. I encountered racist white art teachers in public school in Philadelphia. In Boston, the only peaceful, non-invasive space was the Isabel Gardner Museum. I saw the 13 works that were stolen in 1990, years before they disappeared. Some of the works stolen included Vermeer, Manet, Rembrandt, etc.
So it seems that clearly when looking at your work, that sense of um, those obstacles and how you met with those obstacles really fed into a strong sense of justice and advocacy. So given that it feels advocacy really becomes one of the bedrocks and hallmarks of your work, and which is taken many forms, that sense of advocacy. I feel it's embedded in the art, it's embedded in your writings and institutional critique, in foundations and organizations such as AIR that you helped found in New York, in organizations like the Pests. A lot of people know the Guerrilla Girls, but they don't know about the Pests, for which you were involved in. So can you discuss more in terms of when you really were engaging in terms of the artwork, this sense of advocacy, and in the various capacities that I mentioned? And then also to that end, how does one sustain oneself when one is engaged in advocacy? It is exhausting work. And I'm sure there is a sort of yin to the yang. So it's a two-part question.
Okay. Although it can be exhausting to be juggling many things at once, I feel that the training I received working in a museum gave me the tools to research the underbelly of the art world. I could see it inside out and outside in as an artist. I found that the art world was very racist and sexist, as white male artists were basically all you would see. This would be in the late 60s, 70s, and so forth. Um, that the male artists were basically all you could see, except occasionally an exception, usually a white woman, wife of, child of, or lover of a famous white male artist. If I went to a gallery on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue, some whites who I worked with would say, "What are you doing here?" One white woman got into an elevator with me. This is on Madison Avenue. And when she saw I was not white, she hastily took the stairs. White women would grab their purses in the staff, this is at the Museum of Modern Art, in the staff bathroom, oh yes, in the staff's bathroom. If I came in, Lowry Sims and I ran into a bathroom situation at the Yale Art Gallery during an opening with a show I was in, when an older white woman did not want us to use a particular bathroom. During the statistical review of the art world, that was the only way I could see as dealing with its racism. Coming out to protest end drawings, I won't say the N word, but anyway, was important as it was so outright racist. The work was by a white male artist giving that racist title to a series of charcoal abstract drawings. I understand now there's an archive that has the original postcard and it shows it was abstract. And there's this ridiculous price that you pay to, buy it, so you can have it as part of your archive. The protest was multiracial. One of the artist-based supporters, a white woman artist, when we protested the show in the gallery, first time we went there, they called the police and shut the door, locked it up. So we went back. And anyway, this young white woman artist told us, a group of us, "This is a white neighborhood. How dare you come down here and tell us what to do?" Ironically, the gallery had line item money from the Cultural Affairs of New York, who gave them expansion art money, and they used it to bring in European artists from Scotland and not from communities of color. I remember David Hammonds came to my loft and helped make a large banner for the protest. AIR Gallery was basically a white woman's cooperative gallery. Ironically, I named the gallery. There was hostility towards me, but not from all the members. One founding member for years, she may still be saying it, says that I do not know I am Black. She was always saying that, and it always got back to me. At one point, a women's group, including some of the air people, came to pick at the modern, hang on, and called me in my office. Hang on, I'm just looking for a page. I have a separate page of stuff. What did I do with it? Anyway, hang on. Okay, I got it. Okay, called me in my office and asked me to come down and join them. I said no. I have a day job and I cannot afford to lose my job. They had husbands who could pay their bills. Pest was a multiracial group of artists, Latino, Black, and Asian, in Soho concerning, we posted posters in Soho concerning the lack of artists of color and published a newsletter critiquing the art world. There is an archive of the newsletter and posters in the library at the Museum of Modern Art. The librarian at the time was very supportive. I love doing research, which helps. My mother's degree was in history and geography, and my father's degree was in mathematics and science. My father loved books, and I am a bookaholic.
Well, there is a wonderful yin to the yang, because your father was also very much an advocate in his own right.
Yeah,
But we can get that into that at another time.
yeah,
I think in seeing, for audiences, they're seeing this beautiful, stunning work behind you. So when I think about the yin to the yang, I think also what could have sustained during this period, which seems very difficult, and quite frankly, not that much has changed. It's probably not as explicit as it was back then, but
no,
we're all still endeavoring to level things off, so that we all can be liberated to be our complex selves.
yeah,
But I also I also know that throughout all this period, that you work in this sense of duality. There is a critical aspect, the advocacy, but there's also the creation of work,
yeah,
and very sublime, beautiful works of art. And the way that you have been working, in particular, the use of the hole punch as a tool
mhm,
to create material, that is something that we have seen from the late 1960s that have carried on to today. So I want to talk about your practice of art making of a different kind, which is the more sublime element of the work.
okay,
And could you talk about how you have worked and endeavored in certain modes of creation over long arcs of time?
okay. As I work, my work just changes. I always say it's like balancing a chemical equation. I enjoyed and did well in my chemistry class in high school. I'm attracted to new materials. Actually, I became allergic to oil and I had to find other ways of working, so I turned to acrylic. I was attracted to the circle, which led me to the ellipse. I was attracted to texture. An early childhood experience was feeling the textured surface of a Van Gogh reproduction in my parents' guest room. I would crawl up on the desk and run my hands over the raised surface. My use of punch paper as texture has led to my cutting and punching foam sheets and encasing them in archival jade glue. I do not know why or when I started using the hole punch. I think it was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now you can buy hole punches as wide as 3 inches. The work evolves with new experiences and seeing new things.
It's really amazing, because it was really wonderful to see the arc of your working with hole punches from the late 1960s up into the 2000s. To 2015 is where the retrospective stopped, knowing that there would be fully more work to be done. And even in the images from the shed, you see that work continue in such a beautiful fashion. So, you know, we've done the retrospective. I love the image behind you because it graces the catalog. Naomi Beckwith, my partner in crime, we had the honor of really drawing upon decades of work. It was really wonderful to see those very early works. I think we had work from Boston University, some of the figurative work, and then moving forward to your graduate work out of Yale, all the way to 2015. Now, when you have from 1967 or 1966 to 2015, that is a huge arc of time. And oftentimes when people have these retrospectives, and they see all the work together after decades, things begin to germinate. They begin to see things that maybe they had not seen before. When you see all this work coming together, sometimes work you haven't seen in 30, 40 years, it's a revelation. So I will ask of you, what really surprised you? What became what was revealed to you during that retrospective and seeing all of that work come together?
Well, I was stunned to see all the work I had done in a variety of approaches. I was trained as a figurative painter as well as an abstract painter. I was surprised to see how knowing the language of abstraction and figuration led to some interesting results. My favorite paintings, mixing the two, are Chrysalis and Scapegoat. In fact, Scapegoat's kind of creepy because it has premonitions in it. And in it, there's like this figure, like a screaming head, and out of his mouth comes lies, and the text is there. And I always wondered, because I did the work in like 1990, like lies, who is this? And I realized that was Trump. I mean, there are other things in the painting that showed up that were real. I mean, it was kind of spooky. Um, I remember I have a series of my heads, the three of them at different ages. And the third one, I couldn't get out of the painting. It was one of my old boyfriends from years ago. I couldn't get him out of the painting. Then there's a lion's head. And I thought, why do I have a lion's head? Well, it turned out many years later, I helped to save a lion and his pride from being sent to a one of those hunts, those where they just hunt animals and kill them. I know,
Right.
canned hunts. Anyway, so there are all these weird kind of premonitions in the painting. And so I stopped working that way because it scared me. Anyway, I'm very fond of heavily textured work, which is what I'm doing now. Texture became part of my work in the 1970s. I was also surprised at how long my videotape, 3 White and 21, has lasted. I'm stunned. It was filmed in my loft on 7th Avenue. That building has recently been torn down during a very hot summer in 1980. I was also pleased that I had introduced text into my work. My early issue related work was called Shrill by the New York Times white male reporter. And one white male reviewer actually wrote that my work was a light show because I use glitter, and that he wanted to have sex under my paintings because of my use of glitter.
Mm. Oh. Well, I mean, so much, as you say, you know, working and endeavoring in the ways that you do, there are ways that things come full circle. Um, my next question had to do with what's next for you, but I think we could spend a little time talking about the work that is currently on view at the shed. And I think what's interesting about that is that it is a manifestation of a project that you had really conceived of decades before. Do you want to talk about the current work that's up at the shed, the fire, road,
I
water?
didn't actually write them out, but I'll just read what I have about the shed and then I'll add to that.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, I would say I am shocked and stunned. I am so used to rejections and insults. I would never believe in a million years that I would receive so much support and appreciation. The shed show has had over 4,500 visitors. That's since October. And I did a podcast a few days ago. I mentioned that earlier, where there were 7,000 listeners. The exhibition at the shed is a culmination of many threads in my work. The catalog, I just saw the catalog, I'll be sending one, is incredible. It's like a living thing. It's amazing. It's like a piece unto itself. I'm trying to get the designer's name so I can thank her. The shed show is a combination. Okay. When I was a child, I was at my friend Denise Thompson. I think she has since passed away, but at her home, and her mother was cooking meat. And on their living room table was an issue of Life magazine. And in it was an image of a man who had been lynched and he was burning from the inside out. And the smell of the meat and seeing that image, and white men were standing all around looking so thrilled with what they had done, it made me sick. I mean, I could not eat meat for about a year. So that was really the kernel, um, the sort of main event, shall we say, in my life that caused me to think about doing a performance piece where I was going to hire someone to wear clan robes, and we'd have cooking on the side, and then you would have an enormous image from Time magazine. Well, that morphed into the project at the shed, and the video film covers not only lynching, it covers slavery. For example, during slavery, um, the Middle Passage, some of the ship captains would hang someone enslaved overboard with head down so that the sharks would eat the body or the person alive from the head up. I mean, just the grossness. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So all of these kind of the knowledge just from doing the research culminated in the film covering from literally lynching, slavery, and the Children's March. That was in Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. And the children, they turned fire hoses, high powered, and the firemen were in their regalia. They were in, it's not like these are people just with a hose. And it would blow off the skin of some of the younger children. This is stuff we don't know about. You know, we hardly hear about it. And then I ended, of course, with the march. And then there is Black Lives Matter, and then a long list of people who have been killed because of the police. And then it's in John Lewis's honor. I think the film was about 19 minutes. Uh, and then from there, I mean, it's sort of shocking. People are warned that it's gruesome. Then you come out and then you see this very ethereal, beautiful work to kind of like calm down. Um, and one is absorbed so that the critical thinking that's brought up from seeing such horrific images is kind of not muted, but it gives people a space to think about it. And then they can switch into seeing something beautiful so that the harm they've seen, not that they don't take it seriously, but it doesn't incapacitate them. I'll put it that way. Um, so the show has two paintings that are part of the film, and one is about the little children, the four little girls who were killed in a church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. In fact, I had taken a pilgrimage with my friend Camille Brewer to that church, and there were 15 sticks of dynamite that whites had put in the church, and the church now is still having structural issues because of the bombing. I don't know how many people were injured, but what we did was I had a
There was
read.
a fifth girl who survived, and there was
I
a fifth
didn't know
girl
there was a fifth girl. I didn't know that.
that.
Wow, wow. So it has the little girls' faces, and then there's a wreath of flowers. And then on the right side, there's a text listing all of the different towns, like Black Wall Street, that was in, oh God, I can't remember, Oklahoma. And then on
Yeah.
the other side is a list of Black churches and that were burned down, listing them in terms of the state, how many churches were burned, like Louisiana, maybe 5 churches, and whatever. And then at the base of that painting, we have burned objects. We have like little baby shoes, but young child shoes. We have a basket that could be used for donations in the church. We have like a burned teddy bear. There are just a lot of objects at the base, excuse me, of the painting. The other painting that I call it Columbus, excuse me, and that painting has, these are mostly text paintings and they're all black with gray text. And the black painting about Columbus, we put, I would say, probably a couple of hundred um, hands in rice paper
Mhm.
as the base, and then the text on top. And at the bottom, a group of us, I have two assistants, um, cast our hands in silicone.
Mhm.
And they're really creepy because they're soft and they wiggle and whatever. So we have that at the bottom, and it talks about how Columbus would cut off the hands of indigenous people in Hispaniola, which is now half Haiti and Dominican Republic, but would cut off their hands and they would bleed to death if they didn't. And they cut off babies' hands. I mean, the whole thing is like insane. And it talks about how the Queen of Spain had told him to treat the indigenous well, and he was brought back to Spain in chains. But then when they saw how much wealth, because he was bringing slaves back too, he was enslaving the indigenous people, they let him go because of all the wealth, the gold and the enslaved people. And then it talks about other cases like the Belgian Congo,
Mhm.
where the same thing would happen. They would cut off their hands. In fact, it became really very complicated, where some groups of the African people would like cut off someone else's hand. I mean, in order to kind of maybe buy favor. I'm not sure of the whole story, but it's very complicated.
Yes.
But it's the Belgian Congo in terms of rubber, the rubber resource. And then the rubber barons around the world practice the same thing of amputation. So
Mhm.
that's why I have all the hands. So it's a tough show to look at, but the pieces that are beautiful help kind of soothe you so you can deal with the critical thinking that comes along with seeing something horrific. And it also helps me, when I'm doing my work
Exactly.
because, yeah, right
I
now
mean,
I'm just dealing. Mhm.
no, go ahead. I apologize.
Oh, okay. No, right now I'm just dealing mainly with abstraction and different types of thickness of foam.
Mm-hmm.
I have about 4 or 5 paintings in the hopper right now. Yeah.
Well, I was just about to say that I think it kind of, well, it doesn't kind of, it encapsulates really the way that you work. The earlier idea that we were talking about, how advocacy, how you do this sort of very sublime, almost ecstatic paintings, and they exist alongside of the work that is very gut punching. They're
Yeah.
but they are rooted in truth and they're rooted in histories.
Yes.
And it's that sort of yin and yang that you've created in the shed, um,
Yes. Oh, it's a good way
that,
of putting it. Yeah. Yin and yang. Yeah.
that sort of exists. And so
Hmm.
to that end, I know there are a lot of young artists who are on this Zoom. And um, in terms of how um, you're being so celebrated right now, and I should say that it never really impacted your work in the sense that you have continued to do your work in spite of having a light shown on your work, being celebrated. In fact, as they say, well-behaved women rarely make history. I mean, I think there was something about um, uh, not somehow falling through the cracks and not always being celebrated. Sometimes that can be um, a lot for people, and they
Yeah.
have a tendency to give up
Yeah.
and not
Yeah.
pursue. But you have
Yeah.
persisted. And if nothing else, I think the words "she persisted" really need to be part of the the griot's poem in celebrating your life. Um, in terms of legacies, in terms of
Mm.
how you would what kind of impact you've already had and what you've made, but also what you still have yet to do. I know you have
Okay.
taught for over 40 years now at
Yeah.
Stony Brook, and that is an enduring legacy. But have you thought about legacy, how you would want to be remembered in terms of
Well,
your life and your work?
well, in terms of legacy, I think the work speaks for itself. And when I'm gone, I mean, I'm 78 in a month, but my father died at 98, so I think I have a little more time. In terms of legacy, I have all my papers are going to the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And the reason why I have this image behind me is because behind me there are boxes of papers. And so my legacy, I mean, I'm dealing with curatorial, I'm dealing with artists, I'm dealing with writer, I'm dealing with educator and activist, and they want all of it. So I can't throw anything out. So that part of my legacy will be in writing, and I see the actual paintings will remain, you know, after I've gone. And I've been very good about archival approaches because as a museum person, you can see how things have deteriorated over time. And because I was in a department that worked mainly with works on paper, either prints, drawings, whatever, books, you could see the oil marks from the skin. I remember there was a Picasso print that the Rockefellers bought for $35. And you could see, I think they were like yellow little stains. And that's the oil from your fingers. So I think it was the Rockefellers. Yeah, I think so. But anyway, so it made me more conscious of legacy and allowing the work to continue. I know one of my assistants makes her work on paper bags, and I begged her, please go to Talis, which is an archival place, get something that looks like a paper bag, but don't use paper bags. I give them 10 years. And some of the younger artists are even like they're into digital art, but that lasts as long as that technology lasts. So, like the videotape, like I just got the DVD for the movie Black Panther,
Right.
and maybe 20 years, give it 20 years, and then I know it wasn't a tape, it's a DVD, but
Mm.
technology doesn't last. It's not like the paintings you go to the Met and you see, oh my God, 1700s, 1800s. That's not going to happen with contemporary art, at least a lot of it, unless you're aware of archival things you need to think about so that you don't lose your legacy to deterioration.
Now that's a wonderful pearl of wisdom to give to younger artists, the obsolescence of technology.
Yes, yes,
However, things like oil paintings have lasted for centuries. There's
yeah,
something to be said about it.
yeah,
And I know that you're also an advocate for safety in studios. I think being a
absolutely.
teacher, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know some of my students, because of COVID, they're on campus. Um, and we did get access to the main studio building for them because if they're using oil, they cannot sleep in the same room. And then my students who are at home, I insist that they work on their oil paintings, not in the room where they sleep. But I encourage them to use acrylic, so that's not an issue, but they still need ventilation.
Mhm.
So again, working for a museum made me somewhat conscious of toxicity of some materials, although I'm trying to think where I became more aware of it. Well, I became allergic to oil. I used to boil this incredible, well, not boil, I don't know what to call it, but I used saponified beeswax, linseed oil, and lead white. I'm serious. At
Wow.
Yale, you still were taught when I was in school to use lead white. And I made this concoction. It made this extraordinary medium that was almost like wax. And it kept the color and all that. Well, that was arsenic.
Yeah.
I was smelling arsenic fumes. And I think that's probably why I had to back off of oil,
Mhm.
partly too because I was working and living in small spaces, for part of my life in New York, the early years. So I just, you just, first of all, as artists, don't give up. Please don't give up. And another side of it, you should be also cautious of your legacy in terms of who you allow access to your work. You want to get your work out there, but there was an incident where there was a white female artist who was the girlfriend of a very well-known white male artist, and she was into feminism, she and another woman lived in the same building, and so they would visit each other's studios. But the one who had the white boyfriend, who was well connected, got the show. And what she did was steal the ideas from the other woman. And this is white on white. And the woman that she stole from, I mean, the show was really a total reproduction of this other person's work. She just gave up. She was so heartbroken, she just left New York. So you have to be careful who you let in to your studio. And even with like art historians, especially historians of color, be very careful, you know, get it published. Before you publish it, don't so freely share it around, because I noticed that some of the African American art historians were saying, you know, they noticed that whites were kind of, or the white women were trying to graze them for ideas. And so when it needs to be, just, you know, just follow your intuition. You need to be careful. Follow your, if you feel intuitively that something is not safe, it's probably not safe. So I mean, that kind of adds a dimension of um, alarm, you know, in terms of what you can and cannot do. But try to think of being protective, but also try to get a sense of where you feel there's safety. But don't give up your art, because it really, it can be the centerpiece of your life, and something, you know, if you have family, it's something that makes the family proud, and you know, it's a legacy that you can share with others.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it alludes to the fact that when you're, as a student, you develop your communities, and those communities should follow you. They should carry you. They should sustain
Yeah,
you. I think it's the refrain I hear from a lot of students after they leave campus, that they have a hard time creating
yes,
community for themselves. But when you've sort of grown up with people, you rely on them and you trust them.
yeah,
And that trust, because the art world is really a series of relationships that you have,
yeah,
the trust is really, it has to be impeccable, even if it's someone to say that doesn't look so great, or you shouldn't, you know. um,
yeah,
so you really have to develop these relationships over time and really have an unshakable trust. um, we've come to the end of the questions that I had written and what you had scripted, Howardena, the responses that you had scripted. I think one of the things that we alluded to, and we certainly don't have to talk about it, but I think it's important, is that, you know, when we talk about sustaining oneself, it should be noted that you had an incredible life-threatening event, which I think really shifted the work to some degree, but it also intensified the way that you work. And that was, of course, the head injury that took place in the late 1970s.
yeah,
Um, so I say all that to say that it is, you know, you are indeed a remarkable spirit, not only just a remarkable artist, but your generosity is tremendous. And I think anyone who knows you will speak that blessing into you, because you have been such a blessing to so many people. Not to mention all the students over the 4 decades, but the numerous studio assistants, the numerous young curators such as myself and Naomi, to whom you've been so generous to. And you've pioneered so much in this field. We're only seeing a small element of it when we talk about the artwork. And as we said in the exhibition catalog's title, there's so much that is yet to be seen, so much that is yet to be seen, because even nearing 78, you have not slowed down. So I want to thank you
sure.
for your tremendous talent and for your tremendous generosity. And I think we can open it up
Okay.
to some questions to the audience, Andrea.
Um, yes, and we have several. I will start with, sorry, I thought my video was on. Um, uh, we have a question from Lara Saikali, who's at Cal State LA. And she asks, Howardena, for Free, White, and 21 from 1980, did you receive a lot of backlash? And if so, what kind of backlash did you receive?
Oh, I have to smile with that. Thank you for that question. Well, it was first shown at Dialectics of Isolation, which was a curated show by Anna Mendieta when she was a member of AIR. I had left AIR already. And I basically got silence at first. And then Franklin Furness asked me if I would, soon after the other show was closed, if I would, for an evening, show that tape. And they wanted to give me an honorarium and were charging people to come in. I said, keep the honorarium, let people come in for free. And apparently, a lot of people were very shocked and upset by it. When it was first worked on, it was a downtown community TV in New York City. Maria Leno was the one that brought the camera women to my loft, and she was the one that helped me edit it. Well, she entered it into a competition, and they said they didn't like it because it was very divisive. Then let me see. Um, I remember I showed it at the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont, and it was a excuse me, a full audience, and a young white woman stood up and said very kind of derisively, "Do you feel better now?" Um, then it was shown, I think it was '89. I had a show at a gallery on Madison, not Madison, well, it was near Madison Avenue, but on 57th Street, East 57th, the Cyrus Gallery, and I, I showed the tape, and the young woman who had introduced me, who was a art critic, to the dealer, demanded I remove it from the show, and I wouldn't. So she went to the dealer and demanded he remove it from the show, and he wouldn't. And the show itself got the College Art Association's award for the best exhibition and performance of 19, it was either 89 or 90. Um, she was really angry, and I've never seen her since. She was just infuriated. Trying to think what other. Oh, one example, which is I think interesting. Apparently, when it was shown in New Jersey, some of the African American guards were upset because they felt it made fun of Black women who wear blonde wigs. So that was, I hadn't even thought of that. And then all of a sudden, it had legs. I remember there was a German curator who came to the gallery, and they were showing it in Germany somewhere, and this curator said she couldn't stop watching it. Um, so I mean, I'm kind of numb to it, just because I've seen it so much. But it went along with the traveling exhibition, and it was shown very large. And I had a metronome with the original one, and what they did was put the metronome sound on a microphone or whatever, and so you'd have that ticking as you watch the tape. So I mean, I think now it's like because it still has a life, people are taking it more seriously. Um, I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. But it seems to mean a lot to people.
Mhm.
And, I mean, I feel like I was just really very young then. And to be like an old woman now, it's still out there is a shock. And I mean, the new one, Roof, Fire, Water, I don't know what kind of longevity it has because of copyright issues.
Mhm.
Um, but the thing is, it needs, because it's so gruesome, the other one isn't gruesome. It's just upsetting. So I don't know what kind of life the current video will have. I have no idea.
Can I interject that it's really interesting? Two things, Howardena. When you talk about being ahead of your time, I think about the construct of the quote unquote Karen and how that caricature is very much at play in Free, White, and 21.
Yeah,
This sort of macro microaggressive nature, and
yeah.
then also sort of notion of white face minstrelsy in an interesting way.
Interesting. That's
Uh-huh.
interesting.
So thank you for that. I think that film will have a long life yet because like so much of your work, it really does it always taps into that extravagant vein, so to speak. It's
Yeah.
something that quite never goes away, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We have another question from, this is from Kanashe Juma, and she's a student at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And she asks, do you feel institutions are doing their part to be more inclusive towards young Black emerging artists? If not, do you have any advice for artists aspiring to make it and show in these institutions?
Well, I think it's a gradual process. For example, and I know I get flack for mentioning this all the time, but I'm really stunned that Ann Tempkin at the Modern has integrated the actual collection that the visitors see. And after working in that institution, it is amazing that she's made this change. She has Mel Edwards in the same room with Jackie Windsor. The fact that she's showing not only a sculptor of color, but also a white woman in the same room. She's showing the whole migration series of Jacob Lawrence. She's put Faith Ringgold in a room with Picasso. You know, the flack I get is that what about the staff? The staff is still mostly white, and that is a shame. But I'll tell you, for her to get that stuff out into the public domain, I don't know what effort she had to go through to do that. And I'd like to kind of, you know, like prod her a little bit about what about the staff, because that seems to be one of the major issues. Most museums are all white in terms of their staff, or they may have one Black person. They may not have any Asian people. You know, they most likely, because when I first started the Modern, there was a curator of architecture and design who was Native American. They fired him, you know, and then they started firing all the older women who were about to be vested or tenured. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of dirty stuff, you know, that goes on. But I personally would love to see more staff of color. And I don't mean just my own people, but indigenous people, Asian people, Latino people. And that seems to be the sore spot for all of them. I mean, one of the things that I find utterly amazing is that Naomi Beckwith is going to be at the Guggenheim, and actually is at the Guggenheim because when I was doing my statistics, the Guggenheim doesn't even pick up the phone. There was no way to get any information, and they weren't online at that point. We didn't have that much tech then. So I would love to see museums integrate their staff, and I don't mean having more Black guards or more Latino people in the kitchen. I mean people that are doing the intellectual hard work of going out there and seeing what's being done by artists.
Right.
So that's you know, it's just I am thrilled that Temkin had integrated for the public to see works of color, artists of color, and women. I'm glad that she's done that, but then I want to kind of nudge her towards having staff of color. Because once I left, there was Kinnison McShine. He could barely speak to me. He represented kind of Caribbean royalty, and I was just way beneath his pay grade. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that he was like a brother or a compatriot. He was just as hostile as the ones that were hostile. Anyway,
As they say, all skin folk ain't kinfolk.
yeah,
So, you know, we have to
right, right,
be very careful when we look at people of color in institutions because their politics may not
yeah,
align with the politics of the general public.
yeah,
But I will say, you know, Howardena, you're being a pioneer as a curator coming into MoMA in the early 1960s, really paved a way for people such as myself and Naomi. You know, Thelma Golden, of course, we have to give homage to her
yeah,
very early on. Franklin Sermons, these were people who, and even a generation prior to that, you know, let's not forget people like Judith Wilson or
oh, Judith,
Lowry
yes,
Stokes Sims. And
yes,
sometimes we're only talking about our present, but we
yes,
know there have been people, Lizetta on the West Coast, and you know, there have been people endeavoring in these institutions
yes,
alone. Valerie Mercer, I mean, we could
yes,
go back. Kinshasa, Conwell,
Yes.
Houston. So we've had arcs of time where we've had people of color, and we've gone from, you know, banging down the front door in the 1970s. There's, you know, Darby English talks about 1971 as a watershed year. Uh,
Yes.
there's also a book, Mounting Frustration, where you talk about, you know, people protesting to get into these mainstream institutions.
Yes.
So we've gone from those protests to the movement of multiculturalism,
Yes.
happened in the 1980s, to the diversity, equity, and inclusion moment that
Yes.
we're having now. And
Yeah.
I would say some of the things that are shifting is the fact that there are more people of color in the
Yes.
field,
Yes.
who are trained to become curators, people who are trained to become deputy directors,
Yes.
such as Naomi, which I'm so delighted by.
That's wonderful. It's just wonderful. I
People
have
who
one.
are in positions. Lauren Hayes was just named the
Mhm.
senior curator at the Nasher. So there
Yes.
is progress being made
Yes.
in terms of the structure, the infrastructure of institutions, and, you know, all the people of color are not just stuck on the front lines or in the kitchens or in
Yes.
education for that fact.
Yes.
So we are seeing some progress, and hopefully that translates to a larger, more broader and expansive narrative in terms of who's brought in to these institutions, in terms of the work being acquired.
Yes.
It's not enough just to present an exhibition. The proof is in the pudding when you really
Yes.
permanently affix acquisitions into the overall narrative of institutions.
Yes.
So I feel like my institution is taking some leadership role in that as well. But there is so much that needs to be done. That's one
Yes.
institution out of so many. And there are other institutions that are taking leadership approaches.
Yes.
But considering the large number of institutions, um, it feels very a frail effort in this moment. It feels
Yes.
very frail and underdeveloped when the fact is that it has been needed, it has been called for, it has been called out since the 1960s.
Can I bring up an experience that I had when I was at MoMA? It
Uh-huh.
meant that I would be invited to be on like NEA committees and New York Cultural Affairs and so forth. And I was invited to go to a jury in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas. And it was for a work of sculpture. And I brought with me a white male artist and Mel Edwards. And when it was time, I was the only black member of the jury. When it was time for me to present, I first presented um, Edwards, Mel Edwards. And the head of the committee said, "Oh, no, 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 we're not going to have any of that."
Oh,
Yeah. So, and then of course, the whole thing with the NEA, where they were just so disgusted with anyone dealing with any real issues, they just cut artists off completely,
mhm.
except if they were being shown by an institution, and the institution would get the money to have the shows, not the artists who work in their studios. But that was the kind of attitude, like they would have me there as the person of color, at the front door or at the door. But then the real work behind the scenes was to keep it all white. Now, I think that's something that has gradually changed, but then we have COVID,
Mhm.
I think of Ann Temkin changing things, and then we have COVID and
Right,
everything shuts down.
right.
Things are starting to open up a little bit,
Mhm.
but I feel that the improvement from where it was is much larger than I thought possible that would happen.
Yeah.
But we still need to have staff. We still need to have your curatorial staff.
Yeah.
Um, I know when I was at the Modern, the conservators wanted me to be a conservation person, and they did all they could to kind of woo me, but I just, I didn't want to do that. So there were friendly people, there. But when you went into the curatorial ranks, that's when you would run into these barriers, where it was like, I remember answering, I was acting director of the department when my department head was away. And so I remember getting a call from a white woman dealer. and we had an acquisition meeting, and Mel Edwards was purchased. She asked, was her artist purchased? Who was white? And I said no. And she said, well, who was purchased? I mentioned Mel's name, and she said with great force, N-word, N-word. All the museum wants are N-word. So I mean, the attitude, right? This was a dealer from Madison Avenue.
Wow.
Just the general attitude of the art dealers themselves, and they didn't even want you to come into the galleries. And when they were starting to show this little bit of a presence of black artists, um, those white dealers would get threatened, or they would say to that white dealer, "Well, you don't want black people to be in the gallery. When buyers come in, they're going to leave."
Mm.
Whatever. Now that's changed. Now all of a sudden there are
Well,
all of
in
these
terms,
shows.
yeah, in terms of the commercial world, black is certainly in vogue. Let's put it,
Now it is.
it's
Now
a
it is.
change
Yeah.
in
I
terms
don't
of
know how long it will last, but now it is.
yeah. Well, and we have to think deeply about, the shifting the infrastructure of institutions and
Yes.
and in the entire ecosystem of the art,
Yes.
just the market as well as and museums are part of the market. We
Yes.
are. We're maybe at the top of the hierarchy of it, but we are
Yes.
part of the market. We validate, we purchase,
Yes.
and there's a lot to be said. And I didn't want the moment to leave without paying homage to historical Black colleges and
Yes.
universities, which have
Yes.
really sustained a lot of Black artists over the course of their careers, and could also the question was posed about how to really become how to get into this ecosystem in a way. And
Yeah.
I think there is something to be said, not just about historical Black colleges and universities, which a lot of their institutions are still very viable, but there's also alternate art centers and spaces that are closer to the ground, so to speak. And then one works oneself up. Now, that's not always what people want to hear. I think there's this mentality that
Right.
you somehow come out of graduate school and suddenly you're on a yacht in the high seas
Oh,
and
right.
selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that may work for a season. Let me
Yeah.
be very truthful about it. You could be the hot thing for a season, but
Yeah.
if you want longevity in the field,
Yeah.
don't be afraid of the idea of evolving.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that the field really opens so that Indigenous art, Native American artists can be included. I'm
absolutely.
really thrilled because my gallery now has 8 Native American artists, which is fantastic. Um, just and Latino artists. I mean, it's just so strange. I remember when I lived in Soho, I hated Soho. I mean, it was hard to walk into a gallery without them kind of almost hissing at you. They didn't want you in there, and God forbid if a black artist came in with, in those days, slides. They didn't want you around. So, in some sense, we've come a long way, but we're hoping that this is not just the crest of a wave and then we're back under the water, so to speak. But
Exactly.
because I wanted to open up, to everyone. Now,
Right.
there's a woman who I learned so much from in terms of getting my voice. She's indigenous, she's Native American, she's Matenocock. Her name is Asiba Tupahachi, and she has a website, and it's one long word, spiritofjanuary.com. And she deals with issues of oppression. She went to Howard University.
Mhm.
I believe her father's Black and her mother was indigenous, but she speaks her language.
Mhm.
And I learned so much from the point of view of we're on their land, you know, having someone come in and then you have these terrible marches of people in desolate, horrible, hideous weather, and they die on the way, moving them to a reservation. And there's so much I need to learn, and I have to be careful talking because there's just so much I need to learn.
Well,
But
I think we are all keenly aware of the struggles that have taken place over the course of years. And if 2020 did nothing else, it brought the the things that were in the recesses and in the shadows out into the light. And no one
Yeah,
has a monopoly over suffering in this
yeah,
country.
yeah, true, true. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, I'm trying to decide between questions because they're coming in fast and furious. Edgar Cruz from San Diego State University asks, does all your art represent social issues, or do you have personal pieces representing your life and own experiences, or is there a connection between the two, your personal experience and social issues? What is the thinking process for your pieces? It's a long
Well,
question.
I do both. I do both. I had a series that I did for a while, the autobiography series, and it then morphed into issue-related work. But it started off as autobiography, and the irony was well, Free White and 21 was like the first shot, shall we say? And that happened after that car accident. The car accident, I was a passenger, was in 1979, and Free White and 21 happened in 1980 in the summer. And I started doing a series of paintings that they were personal, but then they just took off. I would say Chrysalis was one of the stronger autobiography paintings, and in it I criticized, and this is going to sound weird, but cults versus non-cults. I know it's just way out there, but anyway, um, I did do a series, and the gallery had like a little orange booklet with text that it represented all the work that was available that had to do with autobiography. But one of the first works I did in the series had to do with when I was at the Modern, I did a lot of traveling. And right now I use a walker and, traveling with COVID and, um, but I've lived in India in the desert on an ashram and whatever. Uh, all of that kind of came to the head in that when I was in India, I became very much aware of women's rights in India. And one of the things that brought tears to my eyes was there was a tradition in parts of Hinduism that when a husband died, the woman jumped into the funeral pyre as the husband was being burned alive. And when you go to a Hindu temple and you'd see hands on the temple, that is, she would trace her hand and they would kind of chisel around it. That was a woman that was, and it's called sati. And one of my autobiography paintings, and I think it also involved the accident too, and it also involved the murder of Anna Mendieta as well, because you would trace the body on the roof where she had been pushed onto. Um, I started tracing my body on the canvas and cutting it out, so I felt like it was part of it. And then I had like kind of flame colors. The piece might have been 6 feet, maybe, yeah, about 6 feet high. And then I had hands all over the canvas representing the different women who had died. Apparently, that uh, particular tradition has gone away, except in remote areas. I think the British outlawed it when they colonized India. But then, within the recent past, I got my DNA done. And this one place I went to, you get a lot of DNA done. And it turns out that I have DNA from New Delhi. So I have, but I also have DNA from Madagascar. I have Zulu. I have Portuguese. I have Basque. I have Scandinavian. I mean, it's like this insane thing. And I'm sure it has a lot to do with slavery because there was enslavement in Europe, white slavery. And Da Vinci's mother was a slave. A lot of people don't know that. His
Yes,
mother
he was.
was Arab, and she was enslaved in the town of Da Vinci.
That's right.
And Leonardo's father was a friend of the enslaver's family,
Mm.
and she was freed when the enslaver died. But
Mm.
no one, you don't. Time magazine is the only place I've seen that listed that he was originally his mother was a slave. But there was a lot of white slavery in Europe, and the Scandinavians enslaved, or they say like the Vikings or the Norwegian, whatever, enslaved their own people in Scandinavia, and then they would go to the British Isles and would enslave the women and children. Then they'd take them to Turkey and trade them for gold and silk. So the enslavement thing is not just our people in terms of African people and indigenous people. Whites were enslaving each other.
It's a human issue, and it goes on even as we speak. That
Oh
in some
gosh,
parts
yes,
of the world there is still people who are working in enslavement. They're
yes,
the tradition of it all, and
yes,
then even new modes of slavery, of
yeah,
people's passports being taken, and they've been forced to work, untenable hours and days. So this is men's inhumanity to man,
yeah.
so to
Well,
speak.
India has 2/3 of the world's slaves, and yet they're called a democracy.
Well, it's interesting to me that you have all this DNA. I think all humanity rests in you. So
Oh
that's
my Lord.
a really
Oh my
amazing
Lord.
part of it. But I wanted to also bring up part of your process and how it also melds into the narratives, because in that autobiography series, there's a lot of stitching and suturing that happens on the canvas as you are sewing them together. But there are mark making with the thread and the needle that really allude to the body and places of injury and places of
Yeah,
healing and suturing, especially in Scapegoat and in I think it was Middle Passage.
yeah,
The body has that suturing on it.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
Can I think we have time for maybe one more question. Uh, Although I'm so reluctant to cut this off because this is so great. But that being said, oh, I don't know which way to go. There have been several questions from the audience wanting to know what kind of workspace you have, what your studio's like. They want to know what type of space you work in and how those choices determine your creative practice.
Surprise.
Well, I
Go.
tell you, that is a good one. Okay, I've lived in lofts for 18 years. My biggest loft was 2,300 square feet, and it was near Macy's at 28th Street and 7th Avenue in New York City. That building has already been torn down. I had a studio in Soho that was about a quarter of the space on Broome and Broadway. I lived at Westbeth, the artist housing down in the West Village. I am now in a 5-room apartment, and the piece behind you is something I made here. And I'm finding that you can be creative in smaller spaces. Because when I did the numbering years ago on the whole country, in the early ones, I was in this gigantic space, with 13-foot ceilings, and it was a square space, which was nice. Um, but those spaces now, unless the building is torn down, go for thousands and thousands of dollars a month. And the only people who still have those spaces were grandfathered in. And some of them are gradually losing those spaces. Perhaps the owner wants to sell the building or whatever. So loft living in New York City is kind of like those days are over. However, if you go to a smaller community, there are sometimes commercial spaces that you can rent. And also, some of the communities to really enliven the community are starting to establish artist housing units or buildings. A friend of mine, Athena Tupahachi, not Athena Tupahachi, Athena Latoka, is in a artist, I guess, I don't know if it's a community, but an artist building in Peekskill, New York. So you can always check to see if there are any towns that do have artist spaces. And she has a pretty decent sized space. I mean, my space is a mess, I'll tell you, because I have on the wall one, two, three, I have 4 paintings. Um, and it's getting very crowded in here. It's really getting crowded. So, I mean, I'm lucky I have 2 assistants who are wonderful, and they try to keep it at a level uh, of, shall we say, crampedness that is not unbearable. Um, but no, I mean, part of it is I have all my papers I can't throw out. So there's one room. That's the room I'm in right now. And then there's a main studio room and there's a storage room. And this room I can do work in terms of small stuff. But don't think of a loft as your goal unless you plan to live in a small town. I mean, maybe you'll be lucky, you know, but reach out to see if there are any artist housing developments in your area. And some of them are actually quite nice. Westbeth is still pretty decent, but I don't know what their rents are because I was one of the first people in there. And they gave me a space that was too small for a studio, so they gave me an outside studio, which was in a very dilapidated building right next door. But I was able to do a decent amount of work there. But I also suggest that artists, when you don't have enough space to do everything, always keep a journal of your ideas so that you don't lose them. Okay, and date it, you know, so you know when you had that idea and you can go back to it at another time. Yeah.
Such wise words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, living as an artist is different. Put it that way.
Well, and I love the fact that you have emphasized, you know, that architecture it should not be a determinant for the kind of work produced.
Yeah.
You know, because you do very large scale pieces in your apartment, basically.
Right. Right.
So I think it's surprising. That's why I was like surprised because you've gotten so much out of that space. It's such a small space.
Well, that tall painting, Ancestors Family Ghost, I did that in my bedroom here as a horizontal because the piece is over 9 feet, I think, high. My ceilings are about 9'5", 10 feet. But I found the easiest way to work on it was as a horizontal. So you have to be inventive.
Well, I know that we are nearing the end, and I know John will say the proper goodbyes. But Howardena, I just wanted to thank you for sharing your insight and again for your immense talent and your spirit of advocacy. They are hallmarks and they have been indelible in our landscape, and you are a living legacy, and I'm just so grateful to you and for you. So thank you for speaking with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you both. On behalf of Consortium, our collaboration of 18 Cal State University galleries and museums, I would like to thank Valerie and Howardena for such an incredible and inspiring conversation tonight and allowing us a few minutes in your presence. I'd like to thank Santos Nunez at Cal State Dominguez Hills for IT support, Chris Toshima for closed captioning, Rachel Gabar and Julian Corbett at Garth Grennan Gallery in New York for their assistance, our co-hosts Andrea Stang at Cal State Dominguez Hills University Art Gallery and Jennifer Frias of Cal State Fullerton's Begovich Gallery, and to each of you for attending this evening. We look forward to having you join us on Thursday, April 29th at 5:30 p.m. as Consortium presents our next platform conversation with People's Kitchen Collective. Our very best to you all, and have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.